Good afternoon. I realize that it's nap time, and you're not going to hurt my feelings if you sleep. Try not to snore, and if your husband does, wives, if you will just sort of goad him in the side and stop it, we would appreciate it. I don't want to entice anyone else to fall asleep. Thank you. This will be my last public opportunity to say that. I have no doubt that the Lord has tremendously blessed this congregation. I can feel the family atmosphere and the love that you have for one another. Your hospitality and opening your homes and cooking. I know what it takes for a weekend like this to be successful. And part of it is you don't get to sleep very much. And yet you still are complimentary of the lessons. You still attend and participate. So thank you. And I don't say that just to have something to say to start. I genuinely mean we appreciate, as speakers, as attendees, we appreciate what you're doing here. And we pray the Lord will continue to give you success in years to come. It has been a joy to be with the other speakers and to get to know them and get to see them again and develop some relationships. So thank you for that opportunity. If you would give me just 2 minutes, I want to give you 2 invitations. I don't know, what's the weather like here in January? That's what I thought. January 22nd through 26th. If you want to get out of the snow, out of the ice, and out of the cold, come to San Marcos, Texas. You can drive, you can fly into San Antonio or Austin, either one. It's equal distance between the two, less than an hour from either of those airports. And we host a ministry workshop conference there every year. It was in May, and we've pushed it back to January for a number of reasons. It'll already be 75 degrees or so in San Marcos in January. And it is patterned after the workshop is called Focal Point. It was mentioned the first night that I spoke. We started it because the year I moved to San Marcos, I went back to PTP. Had been several years before, but I never realized how many people I met from Texas at PTP until I moved to Texas, and we started talking about where we were from. And so came home and asked the elders if we could begin a workshop similar effort and emphasis there at San Marcos, and they agreed. We've been doing that since 2009. The unique thing about that workshop is it's completely free. There's no charge. We house as many people who need it. Our members open their homes. We have housed, I believe the record number is 75 different people who come in and to attend. We offer lunch every day, and we're talking about barbecue. We're talking about brisket, pulled pork, fajitas, Chick-fil-A, all sponsored by the members of the university congregation and provided. Among our speakers this year, John Moore and I are now the directors of that. I've asked John to come on and be a part of that. I know John's familiar to you all here. John and I will be speaking, but in addition, Denny Petrillo will be there, Hiram Kemp, Neil Pollard, Eric Owens, Wade Webster, and a number of others. We have ladies' sessions. We would love for you to be there and be a part of that. And so again, if it's cold here, it's not there, come join us. The other invitation is the third weekend in September to come be a part of the Bear Valley Lectureship in Denver. I know many of you are more familiar with that lectureship than Focal Point, but we'll be studying the book of Exodus this coming year and would love to have you there as well. Or if you're just traveling, I'll speak for the San Marcos family. David and Tina are here. David's one of the elders. If you're just traveling through, look us up. We may not be in Texas at the time, but the congregation there will be like your family. And if you're in Denver, give us a call. But that's not why we're here, right? We're here for me to tell you when you're supposed to get marriage counseling. This may be the most difficult lesson I've ever taught in my life. I feel like saying now, and now, get it, right? I don't care where you are in your marriage. I don't care how well you think it's going. I don't care what you're going through. Talk to somebody. Invest in your marriage, and that will be part of our emphasis. You see, timing is everything, isn't it? Isn't it? The art of public speaking and sermon delivery and stirring a crowd to action, a lot of that depends on timing. I've listened to men who have great material. They've studied, they're organized, they're articulate, and yet their delivery, I feel like Billy, their delivery keeps, great timing by the way, their delivery keeps the message from being what it could be, because their timing is just off. They say that comedy is all about timing. When to deliver a punchline, right? When to deliver the end of the story, the pinnacle of the conversation. I did hear a story on one occasion about a man who was imprisoned, and he got to prison and he noticed something for the first few days there very, very strange to him. At night, when the lights started to go out and the hallways got quiet, that all of a sudden someone would yell out a number. And everybody on the cell block would start laughing. And then a few minutes later, somebody else from across the way would yell out a number, and everybody would start laughing again. And this went on for 2 or 3 days. And so finally, this new man, he asked his cellmate, he said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, most of us have been here so long. We like to tell jokes when we're winding down for the day, but we've told them so many times, we just assign them all a number. And so, number 10, and everybody laughs. They know the joke. And so, trying to fit in, the next night, this new prisoner, he decides he would take a chance, and he cried out, 34. Nobody said anything. Few minutes went by. He said number 12, and nobody said anything. But he remembered the night before that the number 18 got the biggest laugh since he'd been in prison. And so with all of his might, he yelled 18, and nobody said anything. And so he asked his cellmate, he said, "What's going on? I'm doing exactly what they're doing." He said, "Yeah, some people can tell them and some people can't." Timing is everything. This afternoon's subject is all about timing. If our marriages are as important as we have claimed that they are, and they are, if they are as susceptible to temptation and sin as we have claimed they are this weekend, and they are, then we are required to spend some time strengthening, nurturing, feeding, and correcting our marriages. To spend time in counseling. Now, I guess there's an open-ended discussion here, and I'll just kind of close it just for the sake of our time. What do we mean by counseling? We might mean clinical counseling with a professional counselor through behavioral issues and anger issues and addiction issues. And I think that's absolutely needed in marriages. And I don't think we need to discount what the professional world has to offer to our relationships. Probably what we think of when we think of counseling is sitting with an eldership or a preacher and asking for advice and encouragement and strength because of a particular issue or series of issues that has arisen, and we're talking about that as well. But there are other forms of counseling, and I'll just offer this by way of introduction. There are other forms of counseling. They're preventative maintenance counseling that can take place every day in our marriages. It may be reading a book together, or watching a series of live stream sermons from a seminar, or a congregation hosting a weekend like this about marriage. This has been marriage counseling. At least it should have been. And so that preventative counseling is necessary. Sometimes, and most of the time, that type of counseling is determined by calendar. Okay? Think with me for a moment. That type of counseling is determined by calendar. That is, in anticipation of getting married, you have pre-marriage counseling. In anticipation of having children, you may go and have a series of lessons from a preacher or an eldership, or read a book on what it means to be a parent, and how to discipline, and how to raise your children, and how to know the difference between temperaments, and what it means to raise a boy and what it means to raise a girl, and all of those things. And that's according to the calendar. There's a date coming when I'm going to need this information, and so I'm going to invest in getting that information now. It might be that type of counseling takes place before a career change. I know there are some in the assembly who didn't start out their careers in preaching, but now are in that. Wouldn't we have done well to seek some counseling about how to handle that and how to transition into that, right? Maybe it's a cross-country move. A good friend of mine in Colorado is about to move to the Oklahoma City area to take a new work, and he was one of our speakers on the lectureship this past year, and he ended up with shingles across his face. He's barely 30, just early 30s. And the reason his doctor told him was it was stress-induced, and a cross-country move would do that, particularly in young people. And so counseling to handle the dates on the calendar that are coming. But then there's a second type of counseling. And I think that's probably what more is being considered here this afternoon. It's not determined by calendar, it's determined by crisis. There are things in life that necessitate our having to talk through our struggles. Listen, I know that we present a good front in the church because we're the ones that are supposed to have it together. We're the ones that are supposed to have it figured out. But I believe in every church, no matter how large or small, on every Sunday, there are people that sit in the pew who are in crisis mode with their marriages. And it may be you this morning, this afternoon. You need to seek help from a wise, divine source to deal with that. So what type of crises determine the need for counseling? Well, that's the assignment. At least that's the direction I'm taking the assignment. Now, what I could do for the rest of our time is just give you maybe the top 10 reasons why church members need counseling. By the way, whatever the top 10 in the church are, they're also the top 10 in the world because the world's in the church. Now, there might be some unique challenges that we face in the church that the world doesn't face that might necessitate counseling, but I'm not taking those into consideration today. These are issues and matters that everybody faces. But I don't want to do just the list. Okay? I want us to look at a text that will help facilitate the discussion of that list. So if you have your Bibles, I would like you to open to the 5th chapter of the Song of Solomon. I want us to read a few verses together, and then I want us to understand, at least from my perspective, what the text is saying. And then from that text, I want to look at, and we'll do this very quickly toward the end, at 10 crises, 10 things that reveal a need for counseling. Now, I probably should say a number of things by way of warning or just maybe a disclaimer before we look at a book like this. One is that we don't talk about this book a lot. When I tell you, hey, let's open the book of Hebrews, you may know a lot about what Hebrews is about. If I tell you to open the book of Matthew, you may even know the outline of Matthew. If I tell you to open the book of Song of Solomon, it may be the first time that you've opened it in years, and certainly not something that we preach from a lot. Now, there are some difficulties in studying this book. One of them is the poetry that's involved. Now, I know there are different views and different thoughts about what the Song of Solomon is about. I don't believe that it's merely a poetic, interpretive piece to give us a view of Christ and the church. I think it's about Solomon and his first wife. I think it's a legitimate relationship that has been courted, has been consummated, faces trouble and difficulty, and I think we can learn a lot from our marriages about this great book. It's also difficult to study because it's almost written like the script of a play. Have you ever seen the script of a play? You have on the left side of the column that you'll have person A, person B, person C, and then you would see what person A says. And then you would identify the next speaker, and that person would say this. Then you would have this interlude of a cast change or a scenery change, and then this person would speak again, and this person would speak. Well, you have the speaking in the book. You just don't have who's saying it. And so sometimes when you read the Song of Solomon, you can be reading 3 different speakers in 3 successive verses. And that makes it a little difficult. And I just want to point that out because even in our short text in chapter 5, verses 2 through 8, there's going to be a transition between who's talking. And I will try to be in my explanation of this clear as to who's doing the talking and what they're talking about. So begin in verse number 2. It says, I was asleep, but my heart was awake. A voice, my beloved, was knocking. Open, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is drenched with dew, and my locks with the damp of the night. I have taken off my clothes. How can I put them on again? I have washed my feet. How can I get them dirty again? My beloved extended his hand to the opening, and my feelings were aroused for him. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh and my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the bolt. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone away and gone, and my heart had spoken out to him. I searched for him, but I did not find him. I called to him, but he did not answer me. The watchmen who make the rounds in the city found me, and they struck me and wounded me, and the guardsmen of the walls took away my shawl from me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, as to what you will tell him, for I am lovesick. A very uncommon reading in sermon form in our church buildings. So what in the world is going on in this text? Here's what I believe. I think there's evidence to show that Solomon has come home late in the evening. For whatever reason, Solomon had been delayed in his return. It seems apparent from the reaction and then post-reaction of these events that there had been plans for Solomon and his new bride to be intimate that evening. And she had been waiting for him for that purpose. But he had delayed. And in his delay, she had fallen asleep. And so when he came home, he came as the man that he is, the king that he is, boisterous as he is, to open the door to find the door was locked. And there would have been only one reason the door would have been locked, is because the person on the other side was angry that he was late. And so he calls out to her in these terms of affection that she might open the door. He even tries to reach in and open the door himself, and he can't get the door open. In frustration, Solomon storms away. And there's a change of heart, a change of mind in this young bride. And so she gets up. She goes to open the door to find, when she opens the door, that Solomon is gone. And so she searches through the city to find him. Along the way, she meets those who make her way more difficult. And finally, at the end of the whole scenario, she tells her friends, if you see him, tell him I'm sorry. And I can't wait for him to come home. Now, in case you didn't know, they get back together. In chapter 6, things are made right again. But this is an interesting text of Scripture. And I think it highlights to us a number of things that are true about problems in marriage. So what I want to do for the remainder of our time is I want to look at the problems as they exist in this text. What were the problems at hand? And then from those problems, and I think there are 4 or 5 of them, from those problems, and I want us to give some practical advice on how we can recognize those same problems in our lives, all right? So number 1, this text teaches us that some problems that we have in marriage predate marriage itself. If you were to go back and you were to read chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, we're not going to do that. If you go back and read chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, you're going to find that she suffered the same fear of separation back in chapter 3 that she suffers here in chapter 5. Now, I'll give you my basic general outline of this book. I believe that they are courting or dating in chapter 1 verse through chapter 3, or chapter 1 through 3:5. They get married at the end of chapter 3. They consummate that marriage. The wedding night, the honeymoon, is chapter 4. And the first problem in marriage is chapter 5. And that is generally how it works, unless the problem comes post-marriage before the honeymoon. But generally that's how it works. Dating, marriage, consummation, trouble. And the trouble that they had initially was the same trouble they had in dating. This fear of being alone, this fear of being separated, this fear of making the wrong decision. You see, I think we can safely say that people change. Right? Has your spouse changed since you've been married? Since you've known them? And probably mostly for the good, right? But the problems that we face pre-marriage are most of the times the same problems that we face in marriage. Because in some ways we don't change. We are who we are. We like what we like. We struggle with what we struggle with. And that change and lack thereof causes great difficulty in marriage. Listen, I'll just say it this way. We'll come back and make some practical applications about this in a moment. If he has a temper when you're dating, he's most likely going to have a temper when you get married. Marriage doesn't relax that. In fact, in many cases, it intensifies that type of situation. If she proves herself untrustworthy while you're dating, she probably won't be trustworthy just because you get married. Spending habits and work ethics and compassion or a lack thereof are not bolstered by a ring and by ceremony. And so some problems that we have predate marriage, and we need to keep that in mind, sort of over here on the side, so that we can make some application about that in a moment. A second issue that we see at play here in this text is that some problems are not solved with words. Did you notice what he did when he found her? We'll talk about that in just a moment. The Bible says that he was damp with the dew, his drenched with dew with the damp of the night. There are a couple of explanations for why. So if Solomon's late getting home, what's he been doing? Some might suggest that the dewness or the dampness of the dew has to do with the humid climate of the ancient world, and that he was simply traveling. He was simply outside. He wasn't indoors. Wherever he was at, what he was doing, there was the temperature and the culture and the climate caused him to be wet in that situation. Others suggest, and I tend to lean this way, that he had spent the day working and that the day had gotten away from him. On this occasion, work had taken precedence over wife, and he had delayed in coming home. Ever lost track of time? Ever got busy, just didn't realize that it was time to be home for dinner, or time to be back in the house for lunch, or time to call, or maybe even pick up the children from school or from practice, and then they've had to wait because time's just gotten away? That happens to people. But on this night, it seems, on this day, that Solomon had been off at a great distance away, serving in some capacity in the kingdom, and his delay in coming home and his tireless work ethic had caused an issue between husband and wife. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Notice how he tries to fix it. He calls her 4 pet names. And he calls her those names right in a row. He knows she's mad. He says, sister. That is, you're not just my lover, you're my friend. You're my family. You're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. We have a relationship with one another. He calls her sister. He calls her darling. He uses this book 9 times, this phrase 9 times in the book, probably his favorite of all the things that he would call her, my darling. It means I delight in you. You own my heart. You belong to me and I belong to you. Dove, gentleness and purity. It seems to be a pet name. You may have a pet name for your spouse. I'm not going to ask you what it is, and I really don't want to know what it is. But Solomon's is here by inspiration given to us. And then he calls her, and this is my favorite, he calls her the perfect one. If you look back at earlier in the book, she's going to complain about the complexion of her skin. She's going to complain about the way that she looks. And Solomon reassures her and says to her, there is no flaw in you. Listen, that wasn't technically true. You know why I know that? Because she was born into a fallen world with genetic difficulties and problems, and we all have flaws in us. But in his eyes, she was perfect. You see how romantic he's being? You see the sweet talk he's pouring forth here? She's angry, and from the other side of the door, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. And then there's still silence. There are some things that words cannot fix. Even the sweet words. Even the mushy words. They don't play a part here. This is interesting to me because Solomon was known for the wisdom of his words, right? 1 Kings 4, verses 32 and following, that his wisdom surpassed all of those in the east and all of those in Egypt, that he spoke 3,000 proverbs. He wrote 100 or 1,005 songs. You know, we only have one of them. It's this one. There's 1,004 more we don't have record of, but this one we have. He was a man who had a way with words, and this night his words did not move the lock 1 inch, because there are some things that words cannot fix, and we need to remember that in marriage. The third principle that we see is that some problems are made worse by selfishness. Some problems are made worse by selfishness. I don't know everything about, in fact, I don't know much about, but I sort of know everything about ancient Jewish Palestinian culture and how they prepared themselves for intimacy or how they prepared themselves just to sleep at night. But I personally find the excuses of verse 3 to be very flimsy. You see, the transition in words, she was asleep, he called out for her, and then in verse 3, this is her response. I've taken off my dress, how can I put it on again? I've washed my feet, how can I get them dirty? Solomon, I'm already in the bed. And I've already put on my nightgown, and I've already washed my feet to get in the bed, and why would I have to do all that again just to get up and let you in the door? Seems kind of flimsy, doesn't it? There is a hint and a roar of selfishness in her response. I don't want to be bothered now because you bothered me in your delay. And I'm going to return what I was irritated about for an irritation for you. And I'm going to leave you standing out there just a little bit longer. I'm going to leave you wondering if I'm going to get up and let you in. Again, there may be more to it than that, but it seems like she's acting selfishly. Now, in her mind, it may have been an act of self-defense, an act of self-preservation. By the way, we can conflate those two thoughts when it comes to how we respond in marriage. I'm going to defend myself. I'm going to preserve myself. And in response, I'm going to be selfish when someone does something I don't like. We learned that in this text. You know, there was a story told about a husband and wife who weren't speaking to one another. This has gone on for days. But the man was leaving for a business trip early the next morning, and so he decided that he would just leave his wife a note. He wasn't going to give in. Right? So he leaves a note, and the note says, please wake me up at 5 a.m. I have an early flight to catch. He leaves her there beside her bed. He wakes up the next morning at 9 a.m. to a note that said, hey, it's 5 o'clock. You might want to wake up. How do we fix those matters? I think Philippians 2, it's a verse that is given in our title. Philippians 2, 3 and following give indication of that. Do nothing from selfishness or of empty conceit, but with humility regard one another as more important than yourselves, and not merely look on your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others. So sometimes problems are made worse by selfishness. Number 4, we got to move a little more quickly through these. Number 4, some problems are just a matter of timing. You remember what happens after he tries to get in and he can't get in and he walks away frustrated. At least that's my summation of what happened. She regrets what she did. She has feelings for her husband, and so in that regret, she resolves to get up and open the door. That tells me there's a repentance that's been made in the process. I've acted hastily. I've acted selfishly. I shouldn't have felt that way. I shouldn't have left him out. Let me go find him. I want him to come into me now. And when she opens the door, he's gone. You know, sometimes our struggles in marriage have everything to do with when we apologize, not necessarily if we apologize. The timing matters. It's significant. We'll talk some about that in the application. Then number 5, verses 7 and 8 are an enigma to me a little bit. Again, it may be a total transition of thought. I don't think that it is. I think it simply teaches us this. Some problems get worse before they get better. So she goes out into the city and she goes out to find him and she gets beat up. Now, why is she out there to begin with? Because Solomon delayed in coming home. When he tried to sweet talk his way into the bedroom, she refused to let him in. When she refused to let him in, he storms out. She gets up to go find him. She can't find him. And so all of that led to her wandering the street at night looking for him, and she ended up being assaulted as a result of that. Listen, don't think that just because you go to marriage counseling and seek advice that means your problems are going to be over. Sometimes they're going to get worse before they get better. So with all of that having been said, what do we learn about when to get marriage counseling from this text? Let me give you 10 quick principles. Number 1, we need to get marriage counseling when past problems become present problems. When past problems become present problems, we need counseling. We need to talk to someone. We've talked a lot this weekend at various times about the issue of pornography. I've raised 4 girls, Shanika and I have, 3 of them to marriage age. One of them, I suppose, is marriage eligible at 16, but that's not going to happen as long as I'm breathing. We came to a realization a long time ago. She is probably not going to meet someone who has not been impacted in some way by pornography. I don't care how good a family he comes from. I don't care how strong a church he's a part of. It's probably at some point in his past going to have been an issue. And I pray that he tells her about that. And that he gets counseling. That he gets help. That he gets surrounded by those who love him and protect him. But if that past issue becomes a present problem in their marriage, they need more than just each other to get through that. Listen, if the statistics are true that we heard the other day, it means that our pews have people in them who want desperately to be released from a prison of addiction. But they don't have the courage to stand up and say, I need help. And so marriages suffer. When past problems become present problems, we need counseling. Sometimes children are raised in homes where there's abuse and neglect. And from that, the children of abuse and neglect learn many times to be abusive and neglectful. And they vow that they won't do it. They vow they won't be that person. But if that past problem becomes a present problem in a marriage, that needs to be dealt with and worked on. If it's addiction to alcohol or drugs, if it's temperament, if it's just selfishness, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, we need to deal with those things. Sometimes we can't deal with them all alone. Sometimes we can't deal with them reading a book. Sometimes we need to sit and talk and pray and get help and guidance to overcome. Number 2, we might consider getting marriage counseling when words are not enough to fix our struggles. You ever heard someone say, I'm tired of fighting about this? Now, most of the time, that statement is not followed by, so let's make up and get over it. Or it's not followed by, I'm sorry for what I said. It's followed by, just leave me alone. You know, you can only have so many just leave me alone moments in marriage before a marriage is splintered and fractured in two. It doesn't just go away because we stop talking about it. It doesn't just go away because we're tired of fighting about it. Sometimes our words are not enough. Our explanations are not enough. Sometimes it's that way, and we may cover some more about this in a moment, but it may not because we don't hear each other the way we're supposed to. We assume one person means this by what they said. And listen, I've struggled enough in my own marriage and communication, and I've helped guide people through their struggles enough to know that people can say things they don't mean without actually trying to mean something they didn't say. A lot of times when we say something and then our spouse reads into what we say, their assumption is that's what we meant to say anyway. You were just trying to sugarcoat it. You were just trying to cover it up. You were just trying not to be mean. Here's what you really meant. No, I really meant what I said. And it may not have been what I intended to say that you heard. Again, the fault isn't on the one hearing, and the fault isn't even on the one speaking. The fault is on the breakdown of communication, and maybe we need somebody to teach us how to communicate. How to say things. I have a good friend, another elder in San Marcos, who does a lot of counseling. He actually preached on Cape Cod for a number of years and did cult exit counseling. A lot of the Boston movement people came to him for counseling to get out of that. But I remember there was a couple, a deacon at the congregation where we were, and his wife who were going through a divorce. And Buddy said, "Hey, why don't you sit in this counseling session with me, and I want to show you how I do some things." And so he would ask a question, and to get them to talk, he would wait until they answered that question. And sometimes it would take a long time. And there was one particular key moment of that marriage counseling session that she was supposed to respond to him, and she didn't talk, and it had to be 4 minutes solid of silence. And about 3 or 4 times, I was ready to jump in. And I didn't say anything. And afterwards, Buddy said, "How did you contain yourself?" And I said, "I knew you didn't want me to say anything." He said, "I had my foot cocked under the table, and if you had opened your mouth, I was going to kick you in the shin." Sometimes we have to get people talking and teach them how to talk to work through problems. Sometimes the words in our homes and our personal conversations are not enough, and we need someone to guide us through and to help us. Number 3, we need to get marriage counseling when walking away feels like the best decision. Now again, the issue, and we're not even sure what the issue was in chapter 5. Maybe this is just a poetic rendering of their first fight, and maybe it was about something totally different than what the poetry seems to insinuate that it was about. I don't know. And Solomon didn't stay gone long, and I don't know where he went. Maybe he went to his shop. Maybe he went to a friend's house. Maybe he just walked down to the river. I don't know. But he left. And when we think leaving is the best option, we need help. Because that's the last option, isn't it? I remember my dad saying this, and I would repeat it because he raised me the way he was raised. But I was raised in a home where there were problems between Shanika and I. The last place I would have gone when I left was to my mom and dad. That's right. Because all they would have done was turn me around and send me back home. I didn't have a place there anymore because I belonged to her and she belonged to me, and we had problems we needed to work out. But if the best option seems to be to leave, then we've run out of options. We've got to go talk to somebody. We've got to get somebody else involved to help us, to encourage us, and to strengthen us in those things. Number 4, this one is pretty sensitive, just subject matter wise, and I know that we have a mixed assembly today. We won't belabor this point, but when intimacy begins to feel like a burden, we need to go get help. I'm convinced through my years of ministry and counseling and life that there are 2 things that married people fight about more than any other things on the planet. It's money and sex. And we feel like that we shouldn't fight about the second one. And if we fight about it, we certainly shouldn't talk about it. And so we don't get help. And yet there are men who make their wives feel as if their needs and her obligations are the primary focus of marriage. And so she begins to feel as if that's her burden to bear. And so while intimacy might be granted, it's not enjoyed. In fact, it may get to the point where it's resented. By the way, for the one who gives more only out of obligation and then resentment comes, the one who's being given to can feel that and knows that. And it becomes a greater problem than it ever was before. It's probably the most difficult thing for married folks to talk about. And because of that, it becomes the most difficult thing for them to talk to other people about. If we're not going to talk about it, we're certainly not going to talk to somebody else about it. And the church isn't going to talk about it. And so we're just going to assume that we're the only marriage that struggles with it. And I think that assumption is deadly and can end our homes and our marriages if we're not careful. When intimacy begins to feel like a burden, we need to talk to somebody. Number 5, when your spouse loses value in your eyes. I'm going to tell you, it takes a strong person to admit this. Because I promised forever, right? Till death do us part. You're the most important thing to me. But then I start acting like she's not. Has she lost value? Do I really mean the words sister and dove and lovely and perfect? Or do those become trite because I've always said them? If I don't say them, she's going to know why I don't say them, and it's going to cause another fight, so I'll just keep saying them. But the value that comes from that relationship, if it begins to diminish, we need to go talk to somebody. Number 6, when the things that used to excite you have lost their luster, it might be time to go to marriage counseling. I've heard people say that the initial butterflies of falling in love will be gone, and you won't always feel that. And I suppose there are days that might be true, and I don't stand here to say this to grandstand or to make my wife feel good, but I'm as in love with her as I was the day that we met. It's the day that we got married. And there are still things that she says and things that she does and situations that we find ourselves in that I feel just like I felt on those days. Now, you may not feel that way. And that may not be part of your life. And that may be just our genetic makeup. It may be our social construct and how we view things. Or it might be that you need to talk to somebody. Because love needs to be more than an emotion, but it needs to be an emotion. There needs to be a happiness and a joy that you feel when you're together. And that when you've been separated, that you're back together and that you love each other and that you want to be around each other. I think we see that in this text. Number 7. When your regret does not lead you to forgive, you might need to see marriage counseling. I taught a marriage class just a couple of quarters ago at Bear Valley on Sunday morning. We only do 2 months rotation, so for 8 weeks. And our premise for that class was, not by definition, but in practice, we're sinners, right? We commit sin. We're not defined by that sin anymore. We're defined by our sainthood in Christ. We've been forgiven, but we still sin. And we're sinners married to sinners. That's the bottom line of the whole class. So in that marriage relationship, there's going to have to be constant confrontation, confession, and forgiveness all the time. And I think we find ourselves like Peter some days. Lord, how often do I have to do this? How many times do I have to forgive? If I have started withholding forgiveness, storing up wrongs and problems, I'm probably need to see marriage counseling. We might consider marriage counseling number 8 when we begin to take the personal circumstances of life as an attack on us personally. What delayed Solomon that night? I don't know. But I'm convinced she shouldn't have taken it as personally as she did. Traffic is not his fault. High grocery prices are not her fault. Needing gas in the car is not the other person's fault. It's the circumstances of life. The fact that your football team or my football team lost yesterday, not her fault. When I start treating her as if she's the reason for my lot in life because I'm not happy with the circumstantial issues that go on from day to day, I need to talk to somebody. I need to look myself in the mirror and have an honest conversation. Number 9, when silence becomes common, go talk to somebody. And then number 10, when things just keep getting worse. See, there's great likelihood that we won't go get marriage counseling the day we need to go get marriage counseling. And there's a lot of factors in that. There's pride. There's personal will and resolve that we're going to fix it ourselves, handle it alone. That we're not really that bad off. And if she'd just do this different, if he just changed this, just this one thing, things would be okay. But what happens a lot of times, especially with Christians, is we have an image to uphold. We have a church that we answer to. We have a commitment that we've made. And we find ourselves so far down the road in need of counseling and conversation and guidance and wisdom that we feel like it's too late now. They won't understand. Listen, I'll just say this to you among friends. I think I've stopped being shocked by what people in the church struggle with. And I think that's a good thing. Because I think we need a far more open dialogue of conversation about our struggles. Openly about our marriages, openly about our intimacy, openly about our financial struggles, openly about the dangers and difficulties of raising children, about our own anger issues and shortcomings and problems that we have, so that we might do exactly what the New Testament requires of us, and that is to confess and to pray and to grow together. May God bless our marriages, and may we have the courage when they're not what they ought to be, to seek the help that God has provided through His church, through His Word, and through His people.